Look, ideas have consequences. Bad ideas have victims. This is why our worldview matters and why it's so important for us to think carefully about worldview. Well, I appreciate that Cody didn't say where I'm from, because every time now when I come to Texas, when someone introduces me and says that, oh, Brett's from Southern California, half the audience does what, see? Half the audience judges me like you're judging me right now. So I just want you to know, I was looking at some real estate yesterday. No, I assure you, I'm not moving here, okay? I'm not moving here. But it is good to be back in Fort Worth, particularly with Christ Chapel. I love what this church is doing. And so I'm privileged to be here. For those of you, I mean, how many of you were here at last year's conference? I'm just curious. Okay, so maybe about half of you or so. Well, if you were here last year, you know, I talked about the book that I co-wrote with a good friend of mine, John Stonestreet, who's the president of the Colson Center. We wrote two books, one for the adults in the room, A Practical Guide to Culture, helping the next generation navigate today's world, which just seems to be more and more relevant every single year. But then we wrote a book for students that really parallels that so that even adults and parents and youth leaders and students can read that together. But if you were here last year, you remember I said I have 5 reasons, right? There were 5 reasons I listed why I wanted to write this book. Anyone remember those reasons? You failed. That's why you're back at this conference, because you forgot everything you learned last week. All right, no. So I heard someone say it, right? My 5 reasons were Lexi, Micah, Paige, Ella, and Jonah. My 5 kids. I have 5 kids. I'm in this game with you. I'm in this battle. I'm very invested because God has given my wife and I the huge privilege and obligation to raise these kids and send them back out into the culture, right? And if you remember, we use an analogy at the beginning of the book, which is going to help us get into tonight's talk. But there's an analogy we use at the beginning of the book. I grew up in Southern California, and when I was in junior high, I really discovered the beach, and in particular, I discovered something that people do at the beach. And I saw these guys who were sitting way out in the water in the ocean, and they were sitting on planks of foam, and they were riding the waves. And I was mesmerized. And I started surfing, surfed through junior high school, college, got married after college, and told my wife, honey, I'm going to teach my kids how to surf. And so I've been on a mission to teach my kids how to surf. And I realized there's a very intentional process when you teach your kids how to surf, right? You can't just put your kid on the board and say, hey, go for it. In fact, the very first thing that you have to do if you want to teach your kids how to surf, you know, the first thing you have to do is you have to actually protect them from the ocean. Seems a little ironic, doesn't it? Because that's the very thing I want to send them into. But at first, I have to protect them. And now, if all I did is protect, would my kids ever learn how to surf? No. And so in that protection, right, I'm also teaching and training and equipping and preparing them and passing on knowledge. I mean, they got to have knowledge of the ocean and the currents and the tides. They have to know what's underneath them in terms of the bottom and how that shapes a wave and all of that stuff. And then they got to have some experience. They got to get out into the water, but I'm not going to take them to the deep water. I'm not going to take them out on days when the waves are huge and are pounding. I'm going to take them on smaller days, and I'm going to teach them and prepare them and equip them, and eventually I'll take them further and further out. And what is my long-term goal? My long-term goal is that my kids can paddle into the waves all by themselves, right? They don't need dad anymore. And that's what's happened. My older kids, they can surf all by themselves. They surf without me all the time. All right? And so, my 10-year-old, my youngest, is here. You'll see some little mop-headed kid wandering around here, okay? Jonah, of course, after, 5 kids, you start to get better at things, right? The first kid is always your guinea pig. So my oldest daughter, Lexi, does not surf. She's scarred. She's scarred by that, right? But Jonah, we got this honed with him. He earlier than any of the other kids, he got his first surfboard. He's paddling out with us at 10 years of age. And so I'm confident one day he's gonna be surfing all by himself. You see the analogy here, right? We in the church have an obligation to go out into the culture that we live in and be salt and light. We have an obligation to train up the next generation as well, to send them back into the culture to be salt and light. But we've got to be very intentional in how we do that kind of thing, because it's a challenging culture out there. And, we have a culture now where our kids are growing up with drag queen story hour, right? We have a culture now where any streaming platform, there's some kind of LGBTQ shows. I mean, a number of them like Netflix, Drag Kids, where it now portrays how wonderful it is that elementary school kids are doing drag. Right, this is the kind of culture our kids are growing up in. And this is now reaching down to younger and younger ages. Right? And so you've seen Blue's Clues before. Anyone familiar with the show Blue's Clues? Yeah. So Blue's Clues this last year put out a video on their Blue's Clues YouTube channel celebrating Pride Month. Did you see this? Let me show you a clip from it. Okay, that video actually counts all the way up to 10, so you're welcome. Okay? What that video does, right, is you've got a animated drag queen now talking about how family can really be anything you make it. Two moms, two dads, non-binary. There's actually, further on in this, there are trans characters. And this is the kind of world that not only our kids growing up, but we're living in this, right? And so we are surrounded by all of these voices in our culture giving us all kinds of different ideas about the good life, about values, about human sexuality, about religion, and we're just surrounded by all these voices in the culture. And now think about our young people. Our young people whose faith may not be as secure as ours, who may not be well grounded in their faith. And you put young people in the situation where at every turn in the culture, whether it's entertainment, whether it's social media, whether it's big business, whether it's government, whether it's education, they are surrounded by these kinds of voices. Those are what we call waves. And those waves pound us, don't they? And they pound our young people. And if you are a parent, a grandparent, you work with youth, you know that we even are losing some of our kids to these waves. They are drowning in this stuff. And so how do we equip the next generation? What do we need? We need to recapture the importance of worldview. We need to recapture how important worldview is to our engagement in this world, okay? And this is not just to prepare the next generation. This is for us as well. In fact, go back to the surfing analogy. If I'm going to teach my kids how to surf, what is required of me? Like, I got to know how to surf, right? If I don't know how to surf, I can't teach my kids how to surf, and therefore they're not going to I'm not going to prepare them for the ocean. If you don't know how to surf, you can't pass that on. In fact, we have a term for you in Southern California if you don't know how to surf. You guys know what that term is? Kook. It's a kook, right? If I'm a kook, I can't pass that on. I can't pass any surfing skills on to my kids so that they can survive the ocean. But if I get good at surfing, if I become knowledgeable in it, if I'm not a kook, but I'm someone who shreds, right? I can navigate, which I don't know why you laugh, but that just hurt my feelings, okay? But if I'm competent out there, then I can equip my kids to surf. Well, again, you see the analogy in the same way. We in here have got to be equipped so that we can equip others. Worldview is so important. Now, when we talk about worldview, what do we mean? What's the definition of worldview? Here's a simple definition. Memorize this. A worldview is simply your picture of reality. It's your picture of reality. Now, there's a lot more that we're going to say about this, but this gives us a simple definition to work with here. It's your picture of reality, and guess what? Every one of us has a worldview. Whether you're religious or not, you have a worldview. Everybody has a picture of reality. Everyone's got some ideas about how they think the world is. What's good and what's true and what's right and what's beautiful. A worldview is our picture of reality. Now, for most of Americans, if we took their minds and kind of dumped out the contents of their minds, and let's say that every belief, every idea, every value in their mind was represented by a puzzle piece, okay? So each individual belief is a puzzle piece. And we dumped those puzzle pieces out onto the table. For most Americans, it would look like this. It would look like a jumbled mess. There wouldn't be a lot of structure or coherence to it. Because we haven't thought carefully about, most Americans haven't thought carefully about worldview. And so we have a lot of beliefs and ideas, and we're not sure necessarily how they're connected with one another. And so when you apply some good worldview thinking, what worldview thinking can help you do is it can help you organize those thoughts. It can take those individual puzzle pieces and see if they fit together, and hopefully fit those different ideas and beliefs we have about reality and put them together in a coherent whole that makes sense of the world. Right? We want to make sense of the world. Now, think about it. If you're doing a puzzle and you're kind of putting the pieces together, there are two things in particular that can really derail you when you're putting together a puzzle. What are those things? Number one, you got a missing piece, right? You get down to the last 4 or 5 pieces and then you realize, oh my gosh, I haven't completed the puzzle, but I am out of pieces. That is so frustrating, right? In the same way, a lot of Americans have missing pieces in their worldview. And so they're not able to see the full picture of reality when you have missing pieces. And when we think carefully about worldview, one of the things it'll help us expose is if we have some missing pieces. Right? It'll help explain why somebody can grow up in the church for 20, 30, 40 years of their life and still be taken captive by ideas in the culture because they've got missing pieces. Or there's another thing that will derail you when you're trying to put together a puzzle. Sometimes, my kids will do a puzzle, then they'll put it away, they'll do a couple puzzles at the same time, they'll put them away, and then you get them back out and you start trying to put the puzzle piece, the puzzle back together again, and what do you find? You find you got the wrong piece in the box, right? And that's frustrating as well. And in the same way, when we do good worldview thinking, we think carefully about our worldview, one thing that we'll discover is that some of us maybe have wrong pieces in our puzzle. We may have ideas and beliefs and values that actually are not consistent with a Christian worldview. And so thinking carefully about worldview will help expose some of the flaws in our own thinking. It might explain why we believe some of the things that we do, but ultimately what we're going to try and do here is make sense of the world. And it's going to bring coherence, and it's going to help us answer some of life's deepest questions. That's why worldview is so important. And think about it. This is something that is utterly unique to human beings. Human beings are the only people, we're the only creatures on this planet that want explanations for things. We are the only creature on this planet that asks the question, why? I guarantee you, your dog at home is not sitting there right now contemplating the nature of dogness, okay? He's not asking, why do I exist? What's the meaning of my existence as a dog, right? Dogs, animals, these are not rational creatures. It's only rational creatures who demand explanations, who ask the why questions, who want to make sense of the world. And that actually points us to the fact that we are made in the image of a rational God. Rationality is very important to human beings. And this is why worldview thinking is important. Now, when we think about worldview, any adequate worldview that's going to help put the puzzle pieces together is going to have to answer some really big, important questions. And here what I would say are maybe the 5 big worldview questions that any worldview that's going to explain reality is going to have to answer. Here they are. Number 1, a worldview is going to have to explain origin. That's the question of where did we come from? Why is there something rather than nothing, right? What's the origin of it all? And so a worldview that's going to explain this world is going to have to answer that question. That question is absolutely fundamental. Because then that question, how you answer that question, is going to affect every other worldview question. Here are the other 4 big ones. Number 2, identity. Who am I? What am I? What does it mean to be human? Right? Now, if you are ever tempted to think that this is merely some kind of, intellectual exercise and it's just kind of this abstract thinking and, does this really have to do with real life? Just pause for a second. Is this a relevant question to today's culture? This is all we're talking about right now, isn't it? Is the question of identity. And if you don't get this question right, you're in big trouble. That's why our culture is in big trouble. We can't even explain what it means to be human. We don't even know what it means to be male and female. And if you can't get that right, you can't get human flourishing and functioning right. And so you're going to see the breakdown of human beings, and that's what you see. And this is a huge question for the next generation. And they're being given an alternate worldview, right? Think about that Blue's Clues video. What is that Blue's Clues video communicating? It is communicating worldview ideas. Here's a third question, meaning. Why am I here? What's the purpose of this? Is there any purpose, or do I just kind of create that on my own? Why? What is the meaning of all this? And then fourth, morality. How should I live my life? Actually, our culture is asking, is there any such thing as this? A should. Is there a should? Or is it just, hey, I make it up as I go, right? You do you, I do me. So the only thing that you have to be true to is be true to yourself. So are there moral truths that are out there that we ought to live by? And then lastly, destiny. What happens when I die? When this is all said and done, is there any part of me that survives the death of my body? Is this the end of the story? Is it, game over? Or is there more to the story? Any worldview is going to have to cover these 5 big questions in order to give us an accurate picture of reality. Now, go back to that puzzle analogy. Think about it. When you are doing a puzzle, where do you start when you put that puzzle together? All right, you start with the corners and the edges. Now, why do you do that? Why do you start with the corners and the edges? Because when you put together the corners and the edges, that creates a framework, doesn't it? And that framework is then going to make sense of all the other pieces inside of that frame. Imagine starting, if you could identify the very middle piece, starting with the very middle piece and then trying to work your way out from the middle. How difficult would that be? It'd be extremely difficult because you have no context, nothing to frame it and make sense of those individual pieces. And so, in the same way, all the issues of life represent these individual pieces. So it might be issues of gender, or maybe family, or human sexuality, or the acronym, right, LGBTQ. Maybe it's technology or politics or money or career or family or education or whatever issue in life represents each one of these different puzzle pieces. And often, what ends up happening is when one of those issues pops up, we kind of go running to that issue in isolation of the larger picture. And so what ends up happening is our explanations, our discussions, particularly for a younger generation, often who don't even share our worldview, when we start talking about these things, like let's just take the issue of gender, we start talking about this issue, our answers don't seem relevant or coherent. Why? Because we're often missing the larger framework. And this is what worldview thinking does. It helps create that larger framework that makes sense of the different particular issues within the puzzle. And what creates that framework? Those 5 big questions. So how you answer origin, identity, meaning, morality, and destiny is now going to create a framework that will help make sense of the individual puzzle pieces. If we don't do this, we will not be equipped to engage this world. In fact, Francis Schaeffer said this 30-some, maybe almost 40 years ago. Francis Schaeffer, in his book, The Coming Evangelical Disaster, talked about this issue. And I think he wrote that like in 82. And he was a good thinker, but he was very prophetic. And this is what he says. He says, the basic problem of the Christians in this country in the last 80 years or so, in regard to society and in regard to government, is that they have seen things in bits and pieces instead of totals. They have very gradually become disturbed over permissiveness, pornography, the public schools, the breakdown of the family, and finally abortion. But they have not seen this as a totality, each thing being a part, a symptom of a much larger problem. They have failed to see that all of this has come about due to a shift in worldview. That is, through a fundamental change in the overall way people think and view the world and life as a whole. You see, we go to these issues, we go running to these issues, and we try to deal with them in isolation from the larger worldview that they make sense in. And this is why for many in the younger generation, I talk to students all the time, and they don't feel like the way we deal with issues, any moral issues that pop up in the culture or social issues, they don't get a sense that it's a coherent whole. And so for them, it doesn't make sense why you wouldn't allow 2 people who love each other and are consenting adults to do whatever they want. Because they have no larger framework, right? And so that's what a worldview helps us to do. Okay, let's go back to that frame because I want to kind of take you deeper on this. Because at the end of this talk tonight, I want you to care deeply about this and see why it's so important. Because then that's going to motivate us to do something, okay? So we got the frame, right? Think about it. The frame creates what we call a plausibility structure. Now, I'm going to explain that terminology here, but it creates a plausibility structure. Here's another analogy that will help maybe you understand the idea of a plausibility structure, okay? It's the idea of framing, right? But let's think of a web, okay? So you got a web, and what ends up happening is the different ideas that we hold, the different beliefs that we accept in our mind, what they end up doing is they end up creating conditions, favorable or unfavorable conditions in our mind for the acceptance or rejection of other beliefs. And so, certain things stick to a web. And so in the same way, if you have, let's say you have a secular worldview, your thinking has come to be dominated by a secular kind of godless view. Well, an atheistic secularism has other ideas that will attach to it, that will end up constructing this web in your mind. So if I'm an atheistic secularist, and I think, hey, there's no such thing as gods or a god or something like that. Really, at the end of the day, the universe is a closed system, so there's no supernatural stuff that kind of gets in. It's all natural. Nature is all there is or was or ever will be, right? Well, that's constructing a web, right? And then that leads to other ideas that fit with those ideas. So if it's kind of, nothing supernatural, it's all natural, well, man seems to occupy kind of the highest level in that kind of universe. So man turns out to be the measure of all things. He's just an advanced animal, but he's kind of the one that's evolved the furthest. So life is a result of biological evolution. Turns out morality isn't something that's given to us from the outside. It's something we create on the inside. So in societies or cultures, we determine our morality. Or maybe it's just on the individual level. I get to decide what I want to do on my own. You see what's happening? The adoption of certain ideas will lead to you holding other ideas. And then it creates this plausibility structure where now, if this is the web of beliefs in my mind, when someone else comes with certain ideas and they try to talk to me about them, how likely is it going to be I'm going to adopt those views given the web that I have already? So for instance, I'm a secular person. You're a religious person. You're a Christian. You come to me and you say something like, the Bible is the Word of God. And it hits my web. Is it going to stick? It's not going to stick. It's not going to be plausible in this web, is it? You come to me and say, God made them male and female. Is that going to stick? No, because there are no gods. There is no design. It's all, chance and random mutation, natural selection. Right? Do you see that? Are you with me? Okay, I'm not feeling the love here. Okay, you're with me. Okay, maybe I should go to another campus where they're awake. South Campus, are you guys? No, I'm just kidding. All right. Okay. This is why it's so important. This is why Schaeffer said what he said. It's worldview. You got to drill down to the worldview issue. You can't just deal with the issue of gender. And so you talk to someone who's got a secular kind of mindset, and our ideas are going to bounce right off. They're not going to stick. They're not going to seem plausible. And you can then apply this actually to the larger culture. The larger culture, when you have a culture that's come to be dominated by secularism, then the larger culture is going to have plausibility structures, right? And so this is why it might, the larger culture might simply reject Christian ideals now because they're no longer held as plausible as they were back in the quote-unquote good old days when more people believed in God. Now, if the worldview changes, if the worldview is a different worldview, if it's a theistic worldview that holds there's a personal creator who has designed us, right? The universe isn't a closed system, it's an open system. That means there's the possibility of supernatural intervention from this creator. And there's not just a physical world, there's a non-physical world. And then man is not the result of some blind forces of biological evolution. Instead, he's the result of special design. It turns out man is made in the image of God. And so man isn't the measure of all things. God turns out to be the measure of all things. And morality is not something we determine. It's something that we discover in God's universe. Now, do you see how the plausibility structure here radically changes? Now, in this view, you come and say, hey, God has given us a book that gives us a whole lot more instruction about how we're to live and function and flourish as human beings. Does that stick in this web? Does that have the possibility of sticking in this web? Absolutely. Right? Now that someone says, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense, given my worldview. And so this is why worldview thinking is so important, because we will create favorable or unfavorable conditions for the acceptance or rejection of other beliefs. I think one reason why a lot of our young people have kind of ditched kind of traditional biblical Christian morality is because at the end of the day, they don't have a very strong web. They may say they believe this, but when you drill down a little bit more, it's a very thin, shallow belief. And there's not a whole lot of support or justification for it. And so our ideas are becoming outdated. They're bigoted, right? These kinds of things. So this is why worldview thinking is so important. All right, now, what I want to do is kind of just review or lay out for you just a kind of the three major worldviews. There's all kinds of different ways that you could kind of lay out the different worldviews that people hold. And we could get really complicated, we could get really detailed, but for the sake of our purposes, I want to keep this as organized and as accessible as I can. All right, and so I'm just going to group the three major worldviews, and just know that there's a lot more discussion we could have on this. But in terms of kind of helping us remember the three big worldviews out there, I want you to think, number one, you've got theism, right? What's the definition of theism? Very simple. It's the view that God made all. Okay, theism is a view that God made all. There is some personal, powerful creator who is responsible for the origin of the universe. Okay, so that's theism. Now, are there different kinds of theism? Is there a diversity of belief in theism? Absolutely, right? I mean, you think about the three great monotheistic religions: Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. So there's some variation within this larger worldview, but there's also some huge similarity, right, in that they're monotheistic. They hold to some personal creator. So you've got theism. That's one of the main worldviews that right now in Western culture is still in play. There's still a lot of people who claim to believe in God. All right, well, there's a second worldview. It's what we call pantheism. All right, theos from the Greek meaning God, pan meaning all. So pantheism is the view that God is all. He's not distinct. He's not a distinct creator. Instead, he's part and parcel of everything. Now, again, just so you know, this is not just an academic discussion. These ideas, worldview, trickles down into culture all of the time. In fact, think about where you see this worldview, this view that God is all. Think about pop culture for a second. Where in pop culture do we see this worldview getting explained and played out? Yeah, there you go. There's a movie series maybe you've heard of before, right? Star Wars. Star Wars and the Force represents a pantheistic worldview. In fact, listen to the great Jedi masters, Obi-Wan and Yoda, as they describe what turns out to be a pantheistic worldview. Okay, so there you have a pantheistic worldview, right? The tree, the rock, the ship, you, me, we're all part of the same thing. We're not just crude matter, we're luminous beings. We are part and parcel of God. And so you've got this worldview being kind of communicated. Now, if you think this is an accident, then listen to George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars. Lucas says this himself. He says, Star Wars is designed primarily to make young people think about the mystery. Not to say, here's the answer. It's to say, think about this for a second. Is there a God? What does God look like? What does God sound like? What does God feel like? How do we relate to God? And of course, those are huge, big, important questions. And in a pantheistic worldview, the answers are going to be very different than a Christian theistic worldview. Right? Now you've got an impersonal force that you relate to. Okay, so now you've got theism, pantheism, and then you have atheism, atheism. A meaning na, or the negation of something. theos meaning God, so this is the view that there's no God at all. And atheism and all of the isms that flow from atheism are vying for our attention, right? A good summary of atheistic belief comes from Carl Sagan, who was a big popularizer of science back in the 80s, wrote a famous book called Cosmos, and he says this: the cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. And that is a great, easy to remember summary of atheistic belief, right? The universe is a closed system. The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. Now again, are these simply ivory tower ideas? No. How many of you have ever read to your kids the Berenstain Bears? Anyone ever read your kids those Berenstain Bears books? Yeah, you sinners. You didn't realize you were teaching your kids atheism, okay? In the Berenstain Bears book, The Bear's Nature Guide, you open it up and this is what it says. It says, nature is every person, thing, and place here on earth and out in space. Nature's the sun, the moon, the stars. It's faraway planets like Venus and Mars. It's the mountains, the valleys, the shore, the sea. Nature is you, nature is me. And then you open up to the last page and here's what it says. It's all that is, or was, or ever will be. Where did that statement come from? That's Sagan, right? Now, here's the thing. If you've read any of the other Berenstain Bears books, you know that there's references to religion. There's references to God. And so here's an example where someone has some wrong pieces in their worldview. And, which way it goes depends on the individual writers and what the worldview that they hold. But this is not consistent with a view that there's a supernatural creator of the universe, you see. But worldview gets even into kids' books, gets into kids' videos, gets into kids' movies, right? This is not just academic stuff. All right, so we've got theism, pantheism, and atheism. Now, one thing we need to realize with these views, and another analogy that will help you kind of maybe understand what goes on and how pervasive a worldview can be, is that these worldviews, right, will create a plausibility structure, or what we might think of as kind of soil where other ideas can grow up out of it, right? Think about soil. If you don't have the right soil for certain plants, those plants can't grow in that soil. Right? So some delicate flower and your soil is like clay, it's not going to grow in that. You need the right kind of soil. And so what ends up happening, if the soil is atheism, so the soil in our minds or the soil in culture is atheism, other ideas are going to pop up from that. And this is one way that we can evaluate quote unquote new ideas, new challenges to the Christian faith. We say, well, look, are they consistent? What worldview commitments are they consistent with? Can we trace back their roots? And so ideas of social construction, which is big kind of in the postmodernism of the 90s and early 2000s. Critical theory, that's a very big conversation right now. Relativism, pluralism, deconstruction, these kinds of ideas seem to grow out of an atheistic worldview. And of course, if these ideas grow out of an atheistic worldview and we can kind of track them back, then it'll help us to see how they may not be consistent with a theistic worldview. And so, when it comes to all this worldview conversation, what is the most important question we can ask? Here it is. When it comes to assessing worldviews and thinking about worldviews and ultimately committing to a worldview, the most important question you can ask is, what is true? What is true? Which view of the world actually fits reality? That's what we mean when we say something is true. It corresponds to reality. So which worldview actually captures the nature of reality? This is the most important question. And if you get this question wrong, if your culture gets this question wrong, there will be consequences. Because our ideas, our worldview has consequences. Ideas have consequences. And not only do ideas have consequences, but when you embrace false ideas have victims. False ideas, you embrace false ideas and you will experience pain and hurt. Because false ideas will run you right into reality. And so this is one of the most practical conversations we can have. In fact, I want to play this out a little bit more and help you see this whole idea that worldview has consequences. So for the sake of time, we're just going to take theism and we're going to take atheism for a second here, okay? And now I want to connect theism and atheism to the 5 worldview questions. So let's start with the first question. And what I want to do is I want to kind of examine, okay, how does atheism answer this question compared to theism, particularly Christian theism, Christianity? How do they answer the origin question, and then what are the implications of this? So let's start with atheism, and we're going to let the atheists speak for themselves. So I'm going to quote from some prominent atheists. This is Quentin Smith. He was a professor emeritus of philosophy at Western Michigan University, a well-respected philosopher and atheist, recently passed away. He's got a great summary of his belief here about the answer to the question of origin. He says this, he says, the most reasonable belief is that we came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing, right? So that's just a summary of his answer to the question of origin. We came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. In fact, Lawrence Krauss is another he's a popular atheist. He used to be a theoretical physicist and professor at Arizona State University. Has debated Christians publicly. He wrote a book actually called A Universe from Nothing. And there's a subtitle, Why There's Something Rather Than Nothing. And what he's trying to do in this book is answer the question of origin. And obviously his title gives you an idea of how he's going to answer this. He is going to try and give us a universe from nothing. Okay, now, if you read the book, here's what you'll find out. You'll discover that in order to get a universe from nothing, what you have to do is you have to redefine the word nothing, right? I mean, what's the definition of nothing? No thing whatsoever, okay? Nothing is no thing whatsoever. Nothing is what, rocks dream of or something like that. Look, it is utterly irrational to think that nothing can get you something, right? That is illogical and irrational. And so, you're going to have to do something here, and this is exactly what Lawrence Krauss does. In an online lecture he did on the book, this is what he says. He says, the amazing thing is that every atom in your body came from a star that exploded. And the atoms in your left hand probably came from a different star than your right hand. It really is the most poetic thing I know about physics. You are all stardust. You couldn't be here if stars hadn't exploded because the elements, the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, iron, all the things that matter for evolution weren't created at the beginning of time. They were created in the nuclear furnaces of stars. And the only way they could get into your body is if those stars were kind enough to explode. So forget Jesus, the stars died so that you could be here today, okay? Now, of course, notice, he's got to start with something to get something else. So it turns out you can't get a universe out of nothing. But at this point, what we're doing is we're just saying, hey, let the atheists speak for themselves. Here's the atheistic answer, or at least one possible atheistic answer. Some atheists are going to reject this, and they might say, well, the universe has always existed or something like that. But their origin is going to exclude any kind of supernatural intervention. And so you've got kind of from nothing, by nothing, for nothing. Okay, now compare that with a Christian theist, right? So for the Christian, when we talk about origin, what might we point to? We might point to Genesis 1:1, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so we have the answer to our origin is that, hey, in the beginning, God, the all-powerful creator, spoke the universe into existence. So you can't have something that gives you, you can't have nothing that gives you something. You got to have something or someone that gives you something. And so Christianity says, hey, in the beginning, God. God is the answer to the origin question. Now, often the way that this gets sets up, and sometimes the way we actually will accept it like this, it turns out to be this the situation where it's like the Bible against science and logic, right? The atheists, they're appealing to science and logic and philosophy and rationality. And you religious people you're turning to a sacred book. And honestly, when it gets framed that way, especially for a younger generation, it's not like we lose that one. Because then a lot of us communicate, maybe inadvertently, what we communicate, oh yeah, okay, to believe this thing, you need an additional thing. You need faith. You need that faith stuff. And obviously, yes, we need faith, but we need to properly define faith. What is faith? Faith is trusting in what you have good reason to believe is true. It's not some blind leap where you leave behind rationality. In fact, think about what Paul says in Romans chapter 1 that maybe helps us rethink the nature of our claim in Genesis 1. Paul says this in Romans chapter 1, verse 19 through 20. He says, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen. Where? Being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. What is Paul saying here? He's saying that the knowledge of God is available to us in the natural world. What is science? Science is simply the study of the natural world. The natural world in scientific inquiry actually can give us knowledge about God. In fact, when you look at the history of science, what you discover is that it's theistic commitments. It's the Christian worldview that motivates the scientific revolution. This is God's world, and he has revealed himself not only in his word, but also in his world, and that motivates Christians to go study that world, to discover more knowledge about God. And so this is not a Bible versus science issue. This is a picture of reality versus picture of reality issue. And all of the tools that the atheists can use, like science and logic and rationality, are also available to us. And we need to use them as we train in worldview. And so, let's clarify here. I want to go a little bit deeper than in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and explain what do we mean when we quote Genesis 1:1. Number one, notice the claim is that God exists. For the Christian, the claim is that God exists and he has created the universe, right? That's our answer to the origin question. And I want to distinguish the claim that God exists from the claim, I believe in God. Those are two very different claims. Now think about it. When I say I believe in God, what is that claim about? That's about me, isn't it? It's about a belief that Brett Kunkel, that I hold, that I think is true. And that might be interesting, but I hope that our claim goes a little bit further than, well, you believe in God, and you believe in God, and I believe in God, and we share this belief. That doesn't tell us anything about the nature of reality, does it? Except that I hold a belief. No, in fact, I tell my kids this all the time. I don't want my kids to merely believe in God. It's not enough when my kids tell me they believe in God. I want my kids to go further and say, God exists. Now think about that claim. What is that claim about? It's not about me. That's about God. I am now making an objective claim about God, that he exists. And the objective claim is true or false, whether anyone believes it. And so when I say God exists, and this is a claim about the nature of reality, and it turns out that this claim is true, in one sense, it's irrelevant what I believe, right? Does believing it make it true? No. Does not believing it make it false? No. That claim is true or false whether anyone believes it or not. And so I want us to be clear. Our claims, our picture of reality, are objective claims. And we need to understand that we don't just believe in God, but that God exists whether you believe in him or not. In fact, I would go even one step further and say, not only do I believe in God, not only does God exist, not only is that an objective truth, but guess what? I know that God exists. You can actually have knowledge that God exists. And the way that we come to knowledge of the truth is through the evidence and the reasons and the justification. And some of that is in terms of the rationality of it. I think powerful evidence is also in terms of our experience of God. We need to bring all of that powerful evidence to bear to support our claim that we know that God exists. Think about it. You see the difference in the confidence level of the person who says, well, I believe that God exists, and the person who says, I know that God exists. I want to send my kids out into this world knowing that God is real and strengthening their web of beliefs, strengthening their worldview. And of course, we have the evidence. We have the evidence. We have more than a dozen powerful arguments for God's existence. We have different versions of the cosmological argument, which point to the beginning of a universe and reasons to the fact that if there is a beginning, which science supports, which philosophy supports, then the best explanation for a beginning is a beginner. We look at the fine-tuning of the universe. The fine-tuning of a universe points to a fine-tuner. The design in the universe and the complexity points to a designer. The moral laws of this universe point to a moral lawgiver. Right? And it's rational to think. And none of these arguments say, well, because the Bible tells me so. It's just doing what Paul says we do in Romans 1. We look into the natural world. Guess what? There's all kinds of evidence that fits with what the Bible says and confirms what Scripture teaches us. Okay, now, so we've got worldviews, atheism, theism. How do they answer the question of origin? Let's just do a little summary here. Atheism, an atheistic worldview may say something like this: the universe came into existence from no one, out of nothing, and for no reason. Compare that to a theistic worldview that says the universe was brought into existence by a personal, powerful creator outside the natural realm for a purpose. Now, at this point, without even getting into which one that we think is true, I just want you to look and see and understand the stark difference in those answers. Those answers are radically different, aren't they? That's huge. Mortimer Adler was he's a kind of a world-renowned philosopher. He edited the Great Book series. Maybe you've seen the Great Book series. The Great Book series was a collection of about 50 volumes of some of the greatest works in Western civilization, like from Aristotle and Plato all the way through the British Enlightenment. He collects all these works, and there were a number of articles that he wrote, kind of introductory articles for the Great Book series. And the longest article in the Great Book series is an article on God. And in an interview, Adler was asked, why is the longest article on the issue of God? And this is what Adler said. He said, more consequences for life and action follow from the affirmation or denial of God than from answering any other basic question. What he's saying is that origin question is huge. It's huge because there are so many consequences to this particular issue. This is why we need to spend time making sure that we know the evidence for God, because it's going to play into the issue of identity. Identity, okay, what are we? What does it mean to be human? Well, how do theism and atheism answer this? Very differently, because of the origin question. So let's just take the atheist, for instance. This is George Gaylord Simpson. He wrote a book about in the mid-1960s called The Meaning of Evolution. And in that book, he's got this great line that summarizes, right, that starts to connect the atheistic origin story with the idea of identity, human identity. This is what he says. Man is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. Okay, so you see how he's connecting origin with identity. Other atheist thinkers build on this. I was in an airport not too long ago where I was walking past one of the magazine shops, one of the convenience stores, and they had pushed out their magazine aisle out into the hallway there. And so I kind of was walking by, and this red title caught my attention, right? It said evolution in big red letters. So I went over and checked it out, picked it up, and realized, oh, okay, this is Discover magazine. It's a pro-evolutionary magazine, and so they've got this special issue on evolution. And then so I started scanning the cover, and there was a particular title of one of the stories inside of the magazine that caught my attention. Right, you see it? From ooze to us. Now, so this is a pro-evolution magazine kind of summarizing with this title their own kind of origin story and then the implications for humanity. Where did we come from? From the ooze, from some primordial biological soup that coughed us up. Okay, is that going to have implications for what we think of when we think of a human being? Yeah. How many of you have heard of Bill Nye, the science guy? Right? Bill Nye is a well-known atheist. Right? Here he is at a meeting of atheists giving a talk, and he's going to talk and connect origin with identity. Catch this.
I am just another speck of sand. And the earth, really, in the cosmic scheme of things, is another speck. And the sun, an unremarkable star, nothing special about the sun. The sun is another speck. And the galaxy is a speck. I'm a speck, on a speck, orbiting a speck, among other specks, among still other specks, in the middle of specklessness. I am insignificant. I suck.
Okay, so there, are you seeing the worldview playing itself out here in identity? There's no God, no creator. I turn out to simply be a speck. I'm a speck on a speck, in a larger speck, in this great specklessness. And if I'm just a speck, what's my value? What did he say at the end? I'm nothing. I suck. His words. And so notice, origin tells us what it means to be human, and what it means to be human is nothing special. In fact, this is Ingrid Newkirk, co-founder of PETA. This is what she said: animal liberationists do not separate out the human animal. So there is no rational basis for saying that a human being has special rights. A rat is a pig, is a dog, is a boy. They are all mammals. What is this? This is worldview. This is her worldview now playing itself out in the value of humanity. Do we live this out? Yes, we live this out. Think about it. Think about our culture now. What makes somebody valuable in our culture? Think about the ways in which we measure human value. Right? So, what kind of price tag do we put on people to measure their value? Well, we look at different characteristics, don't we? So, maybe someone's good looking, right? And so, I mean, you'll see this. Young people, you'll see this if you're on a social media platform. Maybe you're on Instagram, and, there's someone who's just a good-looking person, and they post all kinds of pictures of themselves looking good, looking hot, looking sexy, whatever. And then what happens? Well, they attract a following. And their post gets lots of likes. And so, right, and it's just our kind of a way we value, we communicate, we value those people. Or, hey, maybe if you're smart, you've got intelligence. Well, that's a characteristic that will get you value. Or maybe you're wealthy, you're kind of in a higher socioeconomic status. Well, that'll get you value. Or whether it's power or popularity or athletic ability, whatever it might be, those are the ways that we measure value, isn't it? In a secular culture. Why? Because there's nothing inherent about humanity that makes us valuable. Instead, it's got to be some characteristic that we point to. And this is how we measure value in our culture. Why? Because our culture has come to be dominated by secular ideas. Are Christians immune to this? Because a lot of times, we can look right into the church and we put the same price tag on people, don't we? There's kind of a hierarchy, maybe even in our churches, of those who are more valuable. Of course, we'd never say that out loud. And those who are less valuable. And the people who have, the power in our churches or are appointed to the elder boards or those kinds of things. Do we use the same value system as the world because we've uncritically absorbed the secularism of the surrounding culture? Yeah. Because we haven't been thinking carefully about worldview. And we aren't grounded well enough in a Christian worldview to resist absorbing this stuff when we're soaking in it every single day. People ought to walk into this place and right away experience something radically different than what they experience in the world. This is out the door when it comes to the Christian worldview. The Christian worldview says, no, there's no arbitrary price tag on you. There is nothing, none of those things that we listed right there do any of us share equally. I mean, look, let's face it. I mean, some of you are better looking than me, okay? And others are not, all right? Some of you are smarter than others. Some of us have more wealth than others. Some of us are better athletes than others. If we took any one of those categories and tried to measure and try to get equality out of them, we can't. We can't. This is why no secular view in our culture can ever give us equality. You're always going to get inequalities. And that's exactly what we see playing out in the culture right now. There's only one view that gets us equality. That's the view that says when it comes to human identity goes back to Genesis 1. Not only did God create us, but he created us in a particular kind of way. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. Right? This is the image of God, the Imago Dei, that was so revolutionary in Western culture. Because the one thing that we share equally is that we are all made in the image of God. So that becomes the only proper basis in which to ground equality and human rights and human value in. So in this room, we look around, and as followers of Jesus, we look at people and we don't see their wealth, we don't see their clothing, we don't see their beauty or lack of, we don't see intelligence, we don't see any of that. Primarily, what we look at when we see other human beings, we see image bearers. That worldview is radical in terms of its impact. And of course, what else does the Christian worldview say about human identity? Not only are we beautiful, made in God's image, but we are also broken. We are broken. We are rebels. We have fallen. We have sinned. Here's what Paul says, right, in Romans. Romans 5:12, therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned. I mean, I think this idea that we're made in the image of God and we're fallen has such powerful explanatory power in explaining reality. How can human beings do such amazing things, build civilization, create technologies that can change the world, and at the same time slaughter millions and millions of innocent people? This worldview, the Christian worldview, explains that. Now, if we had time, what we could do is then take the next question. What's the next question? Morality, and contrast theism and atheism. We could take meaning, contrast theism and atheism. Destiny, contrast the worldviews. And we'd see the radically different answers that they give. And all of that would help us understand why humans do the things that we do. In fact, think about an iceberg. The tip of the iceberg is the only part you can see, right? Well, that represents human behavior. When we look around, what can we see? When I look at you, you look at me, you can't see my ideas and my thoughts. You can see my behavior. You can see the way I act. But my behavior is only part of the story. You want to know, well, why is he doing that? Why do human beings do the things that they do? Well, all that stuff is underneath the surface. Our values drive our actions. Our beliefs drive our values and our actions. And fundamentally, it gets down to worldview. Your worldview ultimately drives your behavior. And this is not just a kind of an up-down process. It also goes the other way. Sometimes you can behave your way you can behave yourself into ways of believing. Like, hey, you're a young guy, and you're sleeping around with girls, and you find yourself 6 months later kind of doubting God's existence. Well, it may not be because you thought carefully about it. Maybe because you behaved yourself into a way of believing that isn't consistent with how you're living. And so this is why it's so important when we're raising the next generation, not just to look at their behavior, but to look what's going on deeper. Why did they do that? Maybe there's something going on at this level. And that's why Paul tells us that in transformation, there's a key here. In Romans 12:2, he says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by developing close emotional feelings for Jesus. Right? No, does Paul say that? No. You're supposed to laugh at that because, I'm thinking, do you know Romans 12:2? Okay. No, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. This is an important chapter in the book of Romans, and what does Paul elevate here? He elevates the renewing of our mind in our spiritual transformation. So this is not just an intellectual thing. This is a whole life thing. Look, ideas have consequences. Bad ideas have victims. This is why our worldview matters and why it's so important for us to think carefully about worldview. Okay, let me wrap this up. Let me give you a couple resources real quick. Our organization that we started, Maven, 4.5 years ago, we exist to do exactly this, to help equip the next generation, and those of us who are equipping the next generation to know what they believe, why it matters, and to live it out all for the cause of Christ. So, I'd encourage you, in fact, this will be the one time in my talk that I will give you permission to actually take your phone out and not look at me, look at your phone. Go open up your browser. I'd encourage you, go to maventruth.com, scroll to the bottom of our homepage, put your name, first name, last name, and then put your email address in and sign up for our newsletter where we send out on a regular basis resources to help you navigate the challenges of culture, okay? So that's a resource. My wife and I, Erin, we actually do a parent podcast to help equip parents because parents are the primary disciplers. Parents, you do not get to just drop your kids off at youth group and say, hey, disciple my kid, please. That is our primary task. And so we have a podcast to help coach parents. And then go out to the book table. Dr. Jeff's got some great books. The Practical Guide to Culture and Student's Guide to Culture are all about equipping the next generation with a biblical worldview that is true and convincing and persuasive. Okay, so there's a lot of resources out there. All right, last question to wrap up. Are you a practical atheist? Are your kids a practical atheist? Maybe are people in our culture practical atheists? See, I think there's a lot of people in our culture who say, yeah, I believe in God, but they live like atheists. They live as if God doesn't exist. He's disconnected from every area of their lives. You know, it's kind of the thing where you go to church on Sunday and you do the religious thing, but then Monday through Friday, God is just kind of out of the picture. And what a Christian worldview thinking helps us to do is it helps us to connect our faith to every other area of life. So what do I mean by this? Well, how does your Christian faith impact your view of business? And I don't mean just, well, I'm a Christian businessman, and so I pray in the morning before I start my work. No, I'm saying, how does the Christian worldview impact the way you even think about the nature of business, the whole enterprise of business? How does your Christian worldview impact the way you view the customer? Right? How does Christianity inform your view of business? How does Christianity inform your view of education? Let me suggest that many of us have adopted a secular view of education, where at the end of the day, what's the most important thing? Academic achievement. Getting into a prestigious university. Getting that 4-year degree so I can go off and get a job and live the American dream. And those are wonderful, good things. They're not bad in and of themselves, but is that the primary goal of Christian education? How many of us are just as concerned with our kids' moral formation as we are about their academic achievements? How many of us are just as concerned about their spiritual development as their academic achievement? A Christian worldview will radically shift your view of education. What's Christianity have to do with law? What does Christianity have to do with politics, with history, with psychology? How about technology? Do we have a Christian view of technology? See, Christianity should inform every single area of your life. So I want you to contemplate this question in closing. Do you think biblically? Do you think theologically? Do you think Christianly about every single area of life? Because the Christian worldview should leave no part of our human experience untouched. In fact, Abraham Kuyper, the Dutch theologian, captures a Christian worldview in this way. He says, there is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine, mine, mine. Business, mine. Education, mine. Our Christian worldview, when we think carefully about the Christian worldview, it should permeate every single area of life. And it will renew our minds and will transform us. Let's pray.
Maven exists to help the next generation know truth, pursue goodness, and create beauty for the cause of Christ. To find out more, check out maventruth.com.